Hey folks, my name is Ted, and you've joined us for episode 8 of the Business of Cyber series. We're super excited to talk about one new critical infrastructure that I don't think is talked about enough, and that's elections, the people, the process, the technology that is all tied to elections. When do elections happen? All the different components of making an election safe and secure. I think everybody, regardless of political perspective, regardless of where you're from in the world, safe and secure elections are a very important part of the way of life that we have. So we've chosen to talk about that today. We're coming off the heels of our biggest event ever. We had 650 registrants last week for the ISA IEC 62443. Join us next week for a deep dive with one of the co-authors for the 3-2. That's going to be happening on Thursday. But today, we're going to be talking about election security. We're going to be diving into one of the NIST framework profiles. We're going to talk about the business objectives of a really safe and secure election. And to help me do that today, I'm joined by Kyle Scott, who is from Houston, Texas. He's been a part of elections, and we're really excited to have him join today. Kyle, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me here.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for coming to the office. Excited to talk about elections today. Tell us a little bit about your background, some of the things that you and I have talked about just prior to the series.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a lengthy and winding one, but I'll keep it short. So, I started life as a high school teacher.
Really?
Realized I was not tough enough for high school kids. So
what did you teach?
Geography, history. And then
Since
I'm a man in Texas teaching history, they also made me coach a bunch of stuff I'd never played before. So good luck with that. But no, went back to school, received my PhD in political science, taught at the university level for a few years. Once we started having kids, we moved back to Houston, where my wife and I are both from, and I joined the private sector. During that time, I received my MBA from Rice. And then, one day when I was adjuncting at the University of Houston, it was a political science course. A student says, "Well, you know what they say about those who teach, don't you?" I said, "Never heard this one before. What?" And he said, "Those who teach cannot do." I said, "I'll tell you what, pick the next election. I'll run." I said it was for the Lone Star College Board of Trustees in 2013. And I said, if I run and win, you have to sign up for every course I offer until you graduate.
Seems equitable.
And I said, but if I run and I lose, you sign up for my course next semester, never show up, and you get an A. Wow. So anyway, he has a minor in Kyle Scott. And then so that sort of took this business approach, sort of academic view of elections and politics, and put a practitioner angle to it. And, in 2022, I ran for office here in Harris County. And, it really opened my eyes up to a lot of things, just in terms from a business perspective, from a process and people perspective, how much better we can do within cybersecurity and elections in general.
So, and the timeline for that was 2022?
Yes, sir.
So in this era that we're in now, where there's a lot of scrutiny around, I wouldn't even say scrutiny, I think, don't you agree that let's just take the American people, we won't even keep it localized to Harris County or Texas or anything. It's a really interesting subject. There's a lot of perspectives. There's a lot of fake news, to be honest about it. Where do you think cybersecurity, security in general, and the sovereignty of this activity, how do you feel that we're doing when it comes to the average election group, whatever that might be? We will dive into it. Are they applying cybersecurity to the fullness of their capabilities right now?
If we were judging it by private sector standards, or by standards that you would use in national defense, I would say no. Now, they're trying to apply these things. They're trying to adapt to new laws, but government, by and large, particularly local government, does not innovate and does not adapt as quickly as the market would.
Yeah, but we see the same thing. If you think about cybersecurity and you think about asset owners in general, you got 16 critical infrastructures. I can tell you that the blue chips out there have been deploying a robust cybersecurity measures for a long time. The challenge is that smaller asset owners that may not have the same P&L, they don't have the same resources, right? So the whole business of cyber discussion, this entire series is about connecting the dots between investments in cybersecurity and outcomes for your business. Because when budgets get a little bit thin, when you don't have as many people, as many robust processes over time, you got to choose the things that are going to make the biggest bang for the buck. I think that the election discussion as critical infrastructure fits perfectly in that, because what you know and you shared earlier, aren't the majority of the people working to secure the actual foundation of the election, aren't they like they're all volunteers.
They're primarily volunteers. A lot of the workers are hourly workers.
Right.
They're seasonal. But I think you bring up an important point. Our budgets are managed by elected officials.
Got it.
And elections happen every 2-4 years, right?
Sure.
You drive on your roads every day.
Right.
Your trash gets picked up twice a week. Crime happens on a daily basis.
Right.
So if I'm an elected official, I'm looking to deploy resources, I'm going to deploy those in a way that constituents will see them on a daily basis.
So you're saying cyber, I'll just jump to it, adding more controls to the overall election process, which doesn't happen every day,
right?
Which people don't drive on every day.
Yeah.
Gets a lower priority sometimes.
I mean, just look at the incentive structure.
Right.
Right.
Interesting.
And, yeah.
Well, if we take politics totally out of it, I think you'd agree there exists some frameworks out there. We're going to talk about it today there, but I think for the audience, a really good primer would be, let's talk about the nature of the challenges of just election security and the way it's developed. Viviana, can we take a look at the agenda slide? So as we dive in, well, before that, I'm sorry, if you go back a slide, Viviana, would you tell us a little bit about the Texas Gulf Coast Center for Public Policy, kind of what you're doing on a regular basis now and how that kind of dovetails into what we're talking about?
Sure. So one of the things that we're focused on is a lot of national issues tend to dominate local politics.
Right.
And the whole idea is there are some national issues that may apply to local politics, but not all do. In Houston, in the Gulf Coast region, we have things that are unique to our area, just like Chicago does, just like Minneapolis does. So what we're trying to do is at least raise the awareness of those issues, whether it be human trafficking or some crime or flooding or something of those, because we think people need to be informed and make decisions based upon what's local and pertinent to the offices that are local.
And when we teamed up, it was actually over coffee about election security.
Yes.
Where that was one of the big things that you wanted to talk to this local region about, started asking me questions about it, and then we landed on there does exist a NIST framework profile for cybersecurity. That's where we came to this conclusion. Well, good stuff. Viviana, take us to the agenda and let's talk a little bit about it. So let's talk about critical infrastructure. Let's talk about elections as critical infrastructure, right? Let's then dive into NIST IR 8310, which is essentially I guess for the NIST CSF experts out there, it's kind of a subset of controls selection that map to some business applications. I'm going to dive into that and talk about it. Would love your perspective on what this group and the document thinks about actual mission objectives, right? And then I think we finish up just talking about what are the real world applications and challenges, right? So let's dive in. So Viviana, let's put on the slide there, registration, poll book, voting machine, tabulation website. You know, there are about 10 different functions of an election, and just moving left to right. I mean, we see voters need to be registered. There's a poll book preparation. There's a poll book usage. Now we have to prepare the ballots. There are these voting machines. Then you have to actually create a system around the usage of those, probably the certification as well. Then you have to move into the tabulation phase of an election where you're actually counting the votes and tabulating it. And then finally, you know, how do you access different information? I'm assuming that's where, when you look at the website for access to kind of the security or the legal ramifications or any sort of data, the FAQs, there's this ecosystem that very much mimics critical infrastructure, whether you're OT, whether you're IT, whether you are looking at the Purdue model, whether you're looking at an expanded group of people geographically, whether it's a chemical company or whether it's a manufacturing company, the people, process, and technology at a given entity, let's say, it gets really complicated. I don't know, though, if anybody really understands how complicated it is to prepare for, execute, and then make sure you are secure even after the fact with voting in general.
Sure.
Am I right about that? What are people not thinking of when it comes to the complexity of voting as a critical component of our nation?
And when most people see it, we think about what we hear on the news.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, every process can be improved.
Right.
Right. And it's that need to innovate. And so when we're looking at this in a county like Harris County, you have 1,777 square miles with 2.5 million voters.
Mm-hmm.
Every year, tens of thousands of people move in and out.
Mm.
So every year there's people registering who move out, who may decide not to register their new address for whatever reason. Then you have people deployed in military. You have people crossing that 65-year-old barrier where then they can vote by ballot by mail. So you have all of this registration going on that's a year-round function.
So you have a constant movement or flux
Yes.
of people in and out of the system.
And a lot of it is an opt-in voluntary mechanism on whether or not I just decide to let you know.
You know, in the true blue cybersecurity world of, let's say, a chemical company or an offshore rig, I would compare the movement of people in and out of Harris County as an example, as the same thing of movement of components or devices in and out of a major ICS environment. And so that's one of the challenges that a lot of CISOs have right now is they have to have some level of software inventory, hardware inventory, because they have to know what am I securing and what does that look like? You're saying the same applies, only in this case for elections, it's the people.
Yes.
It's people that are actually going to go vote.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the challenges at that front end is we want to make it easy for people to register.
Right.
But we also want to make it secure.
It's tough.
So
and there's a lot of partisan politics in that too, correct?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of politics. I'm not sure everything is duly agreed upon. Yeah, it's a challenge. So you move from, so you got the people side. What else is a major component of safe and fair elections?
And then, so once you get to that stage, you're 75 days out. If there's any challenges to the voter rolls, those are done 75 days out. It goes to an elections administrator, and then a decision's made on who can stay on the roll and who can't.
Got it.
And then really the next big move is mail-in ballots start going out. So in Texas, you have to request a mail-in ballot form, and then a mail-in ballot is then sent to you about 4 to 6 weeks out from the election date.
Right.
And then you have to turn that in by the election date. So mail it back, you can hand deliver it.
So let's talk about the processes real quick.
Sure.
One of the things that we'll dive into a little bit is you got kind of a game day mentality when it comes to voting.
Yeah.
You've got a day that the polls open, they're open for a certain window of time. But what you just described is you've actually got to implement the same level of procedural focus way before, because the mail-in ballots have to have the same amount of security. How challenging is that when you're dealing with, I would say, primarily a volunteer-based organization, or at least people that don't work 24/7, 365.
Right.
How big of a challenge is that on the process side?
It's a huge challenge, not only to get the people trained, but then to get them to know what to look for, what the rules are, because every 2 years, the legislature adds laws or changes the laws. So you have to constantly keep people abreast of that. And where we are now is it's still such a manual process because you have to sign your ballot once you mail it in. So somebody has to compare signatures.
Yeah. So we're dealing with, I mean, look, in the cybersecurity world in general, there are a lot of solutions to drive efficiency and automation. And you'd be amazed at how many people are still tabulating cyber controls via Excel file, or they're doing everything manual. There's a value to it if you're early because you get a lot of oversight on it. Okay, so we talked about people. We talked a little bit about process. Let's talk about tech. When you think about the election infrastructure as a technology base, what are we talking about?
So primarily when we think about this, it's the machines.
Okay.
So these machines are stored in a large storage facility.
Who owns them?
So an elections administrator can either lease them from a Hart or a Dominion, or can outright purchase them.
Right.
Harris County's purchased theirs.
So for all the folks in critical infrastructure that are actually practitioners, I mean, this is exactly like an OEM. When we think about the voting machines, I mean, these are original equipment manufacturers. They have their own hardware, software updates. They have their own leasing. They have their own kind of managed services associated with deployment of the machines, as well as like the updates of them. I mean, the average person's probably not thinking about this, but when you start thinking about PLCs, you start thinking about controllers, it's the same thing. Don't you think?
Sure.
Who owns, when you buy it or you lease it from a given organization, there sometimes can be a little bit of a gray area on who's going to deploy it, who owns the responsibility for updating it. And we've seen that in the national news cycle become an issue, right?
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about basic things like if you have a do not tamper tape, now who owns that?
Right.
Is that the manufacturer? Is that
the thing is
something
Kyle,
like that?
I know it is the same kind of challenges in some of the heaviest industries out there. So no doubt that to me, I'm always shocked at the utter complexity when you really get granular. Who owns that tape, right? Who actually owns that software inventory, and who's going to actually, how often is it going to be updated, right? This all maps to a critical infrastructure entity, let's say, okay, to their risk management program, right? That's where you get information security officers. That's where you get your IT people. That's where you get risk people. NIST saw this in 2019, came out with, let's go to the next slide, Viviana, developed an actual public draft in 2019 that mapped back to NIST CSF. So for those novices that are listening in, NIST is a framework that you can use, 108 subcontrols, and it basically will tell you, diving into 5 different, let's call them categories, really domains. Identify helps you understand what the overall risk management program is. How do you identify that something has happened that probably shouldn't be happening? Protect are all the different controls that are designed to actually protect and harden the infrastructure so that they don't get hit by a cyber attack. When you get into detect, that's really your capacity as an organization to recognize a change in your overall infrastructure security profile. Something has happened. You have to have some element of a capability to say, it was like this on Monday, now it looks like this on Tuesday. That's an issue. And then once you determine that that is an event or an incident, you move into that respond phase. Like, how do I actually respond to get my systems back up online? How do I take them online? How do I make decisions about that? A lot of this comes down to an incident response exercise. And then finally, how do you recover, right? So these, for anybody that is new to NIST, there's 108 subcategories that essentially give you a list of controls by domain that you can go and implement as a recommendation to make your critical infrastructure secure. And it's interesting, there are not framework profiles for every sector, but I started looking, I guess about last year, and found it quite interesting how in depth the profile was for elections. So let's dive into a couple of them. Can you go to our next slide? Next slide, I think, is just a breakdown of the core security control categories within identify and protect. Asset management, the risk assessment, these are all things that I think you'll find in the framework profile have been deemed very important. Next slide. Anybody that wants these slides, this is so available online, but I think it's just to lay the foundation that what we're going to be talking about with 8310 today, you have to understand the overall framework to understand the real profile. So as you can see here, we've got different categories underneath the different unique identifiers. So let's go to that next slide. That's table 2 from 8310. Now, 8310 was it's a cybersecurity framework election infrastructure profile. What that means is very smart people came together that know a lot about this sector. Okay, I think it came from I can't recall who actually was the ones that were meeting, but they met in a closed door session and they talked about what are the different things that have to go right for an election. Let's call those mission objectives. There's 10 of them. You can see them up on the screen. And then out of all the hundreds and hundreds of questions you can ask this election group, out of the hundreds of controls that you could possibly put in place, which one are the controls that are the most important to meet that mission objective, right? So it's about 82 pages long, and the whole function, in my opinion, is to look at this mission objective. Now, let's take a look at them. Conduct and oversee voting period activities, prepare and maintain election systems, process and maintain voter registration. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to explain just right out of the book each of these, and I'd love your input.
Sure.
If you think these are essentially the top 3 or 4, right? So conduct and oversee voting period activities. Critical infrastructure is on almost all the time, unless you're a rig that is on and off, whether you're a pipeline that is on and off. I mean, critical infrastructure generally stays up all the time. Voting isn't like that.
No.
So one of the first things that I found very interesting is conduct and oversee voting periods as a mission objective for this profile is double underline. It's during the time when voters can submit their votes, which we already know is twice. You can do it in person. You can also do mail-in.
Correct.
But this is mostly about all of the activities required for remote voting, early person voting, election day voting, and provisional ballot voting, right? And so the activities that roll up to this mission are the open and the close of the polls, the voting systems up and running effectively, people actually voting, voter check-in. And so what I thought interesting about their number one mission objective was this game day activity.
Yep.
And so explain the challenges. So let's say you and I are like the cyber experts and we come into a polling location. We say, hey, we've got to do an audit or an assessment to make sure that your game day activities are up to snuff, right?
Sure.
How hard is that to do given the game day activities that are ongoing just to get the elections rolling?
Sure. I mean, if you just lay out the framework. So we had on election day, not early voting, but on election day, 836 polling locations.
Just here in Harris County.
Just here in Harris County.
To serve 2.5 million voters.
Yes, sir.
Got
So, and if you think about that, within each of those things, depending upon the expected turnout at each of those locations, you could have anywhere from 4 to 12 machines in each of those locations. So all of those have to be transported. All of them have to be set up and turned on. But prior to election day, you have 14 days of early voting. Now, there are fewer polling locations, but each of those has to be secured overnight. They all have to be set up properly and shut down properly at the end of the night. And so you have this immense network that has to be mobilized overnight and then taken down overnight.
Wow. And so that's interesting because that would be like 800 plus facilities that have to operate seamlessly across vast geographies, and critical infrastructure players already have a challenge of doing that logistically, operationally.
Yes.
When we take a look at the actual overseeing of these activities, can you go to the next slide, Viviana? I want to keep going back and forth between the slide you're on for table 2 and then the next one. So what the profile has done is it said high priority as well as medium to high priorities for this particular mission objective that we're talking about. Asset management, governance, risk assessment. These are the way that I would put them in layman's terms is you have to have a scalable, documented, understood program for what risk management looks like. Now, if you dive in one level deeper, how do you verify that it's in place? You do a risk assessment. What are you verifying that's in place? The governance programs. Asset management is its own holistic category that incorporates knowing what you have on site. So that could be, in this particular case, it's actually going to be the voting machines technically. Those 3 categories are huge. When realistically can, just the way that elections are run, when can you actually go in and do risk assessments? When can you actually establish a governance program? Does that happen 2 weeks prior to everybody being hired?
So ideally you have the program in place and it's just about compliance and reporting during the process, right? During the voting stage.
And who would own that, Kyle?
The election administrator. So or Harris County in this regard. So Harris County administers most of the elections that happen in the county. There's maybe some small municipalities that conduct their own, but it would be the governing body of Harris County.
And so all 836, I can make it the number,
sure,
but 800 plus sites, how many people are at each site? On average?
Again, it's depending on turnout, but you need at least 3. You need somebody to check in. Then
so
you
we're
need
talking
a worker.
thousands of people
Oh,
at
yeah.
work. So you got thousands of people. You have almost 1,000 locations. You have a minimum of what? 2, 3, 4. Got a question?
Yeah.
Great.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
2 or 3 voting machines at every location. Is it, I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of people to follow a governance program. And my gut tells me, just because I don't know it, is there a scalable, this is not putting anybody in a corner. I'm just saying how challenging it is. If you went and asked all those election workers, if you went and asked all the volunteers, can they point to a governance program that they're supposed to align to?
No. So if you've gone through the training program, you are trained and it references statute or references ordinance, but it's not within the broader context of here are the standards that we're trying to uphold.
Right.
And then it makes it very difficult to know, okay, well, here are the boxes I'm supposed to check, but to what ends am I doing that?
Yeah, we just had a comment from Anna. Thanks for your insight. In my experience, a comprehensive OT cyber risk management program should drive owner and custodian responsibilities that define data risk and controls management ownership. Couldn't agree more, Anna.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is you've got a lot of people that don't do this every day.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of processes that undoubtedly are a little different at every location. We know that, right? Because that's the nature of 830
That's just the
different
nature of
locations.
people.
One's in the school. One's here. We've got a big challenge on our hand. I don't even want to talk about who owns kind of the hardware inventory.
Yeah.
Because with ever hardware inventory, that voting machine, not pointing fingers, that's a big job.
Yeah.
It's a big job. And there's so many, I just continue to be shocked at how many direct correlations there are to elections and what
Sure.
we consider like the industrial control system environment.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm sorry to make it more complicated, but that's just the big voting machine. Now, how are you going to power it? Does your volunteer have a power cord? You know, what happens with the paper and the toner to make these things run? Who's the response team to get out and solve these problems in the middle of the day? What happens if the machine fills up because we've received so many ballots? Do we have to shut the polling location down in order to collect those ballots? And you need protocols for all of that.
Yeah. And just once again, not pointing fingers, I'm really curious.
Sure.
Who owns the responsibility of the definition of those governance programs? And in turn, the auditing or assessing of those governance programs.
Sure.
That's the county.
So the county. So it's just like any other, I guess, industry in which Congress, or in this case, the legislature, will write a law, and then it's up to the administrative arm to promulgate that law, to show what this looks like in action.
Well, the interesting thing is there's a lot of smart people who sit together to build a framework profile like this. But in my kind of talks on LinkedIn and prep for this, a lot of people didn't know this existed. This is a good standard. I mean, it's telling you that there already exists a standard called NIST CSF, and it's giving you a very detailed recommendation of, for that mission objective, you need to do these things. Let's dive to the next. Prepare and maintain election systems. So this mission objective encompasses pretty much everything about the actual systems, right? With the exception of the voter registration side, because I think that's a Secretary of State thing, right?
Yep.
Workshop participants are basically have to get these systems ready. And this is about the voting system and supplies, the test and the certification. So if we go to, looks like you're already there, Viviana.
So I'm going to back you up just a second on the voter registration.
Yep.
So the actual registering voters and validating those rolls happens at the local level, but then that information is sent to the Secretary of State to house. So there's still a link in that, for lack of a better term, a supply chain, which is the overseer of the operation doesn't actually go out and collect that information. That's all done at the local level. And then they're responsible for then turning it over. And it's depending upon any of the 254 counties you're in, it can be done in any number of ways.
So that handoff, that chain of custody is something that is that in here as one of our mission objectives? Perform election administrative functions. Let's go to number 5 real quick.
Sure.
Bring up a good point. So acquisition of election related tools, staff acquire support service contracts, data hygiene, manage chain of custody. Yeah, we guessed it. So that would be one of the core functions. Look, I think if you just watch the news cycle, like this entire chain of custody, what is really data, what is really true? I mean, it's a big challenge. It's interesting that, I mean, look, they're all important. This was listed as number 5. Let's go straight to number 5. So go to mission objective number 5, V. Looks like business environment and governance in the identify phase is a high priority. So this is essentially the governance function. Like, who owns this? How do you transfer this? What's the system of record to do so? That's a challenge. As you look at kind of the moderate and high priority functions, this is where awareness and training comes in. Data security, which is huge, as well as recovery planning. No question that planning for some sort of recovery through incident response. I mean, I think through an incident response exercise or program tied to some sort of awareness training, it's all going to be tied to your governance, which makes perfect sense on number 5. So let's talk really quick. Let's choose one to talk about. I'm going to go down the list and we'll dive in. If you can go back to the mission objectives, V. So conduct and oversee voting period activities, prepare and maintain election systems, process and maintain voter registration, and prepare for a specific election.
Yes.
Out of those 4, which one do you think probably has the most challenges, and we'll dive in?
I think it's probably setting up for game day.
So that would be prepare for a specific election.
And the only reason I'm saying that is because there are so many people and moving parts involved.
Yep.
I'm not trying to prioritize on what's most important for securing elections. I'm just saying, if I'm looking at this from a management standpoint, I'm going to look around and say, oh my goodness, there's a lot of people.
So let's dive in. So this particular mission objective is all the activities that need to take place for a specific election. Establish voting locations, transport and store equipment, process candidate filing and constitute. Go to mission objective 4. I think that's where you're going to be able to see for those in the audience that are taking a look. Process candidate filings, prepare voting materials, maintain geographical data. I mean, this is a very data oriented.
Yep.
Like, where does the data reside, Kyle?
So, and this is the crazy part, is it's so decentralized, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there's not a comprehensive way in which you manage these things.
Right.
And there's not a comprehensive or at least uniform reporting requirement. So if I want to find which candidates have filed for the city of Houston race, well, the city of Houston keeps that, even though Harris County can be overseeing that election.
Right.
Right.
I mean, so if we look at the specific NIST profile requirements for MO4, this one, I'm scratching my head a little bit. You've got asset management, you've got governance in there on the identify phase. I think that's fair. I totally agree with awareness. Information protection procedures and policies, that's huge. Because when I think there's a direct correlation, a positive one, in the increased risk that you have and the decentralization of a given data set. And I think there's complexity when you're trying to manage it all in one central data center, right? Yep. And then there's a bunch of questions about that data center and who runs it and who owns it. I get it. So I couldn't agree more. Where I'm a little curious what the authors were thinking is on the detect phase. Anomalies and events is kind of like a managed detection response capability you need to be able to see. I'm assuming what they're thinking about is as you have a clean set of data, if that data is exported or changed, it's probably what the authors were thinking about.
Yeah.
Let's talk about like the actual functionality. Where's this data? It's on a computer?
Yes.
Okay, and that computer is decentralized to a polling location?
So they're all collected at the polling location, then they're taken back to what's central count, and it's all downloaded. Now, different people, different jurisdictions handle it different ways.
Right.
So if you think about in South Carolina, that's all those voting machines are collected, it's all downloaded, and then when they're ready to report the results, they export that to a third party to then send that back to their website. It's not a direct one-to-one link.
So we just got
it's just bouncing around all over.
So we just got a comment that I think is pertinent to this conversation. I'm about to thumbs up it. So Anand, thanks for your comment. So who owns the risk of a breach, a malfunction, or some sort of inherent mess up? Who makes a decision for immediate damage control, as well as whether it's critical or not?
Correct.
So I'm just let's be honest here. So we have a critical infrastructure series of people, process, and tech.
Sure.
One of the biggest functions is getting ready for the election. There's a cleanliness and a security of the data, but that's so decentralized. They can all follow their own processes for getting it to and from. Is there honestly a mechanism to determine some sort of anomaly? And is there some sort of chain of command to determine what we do about it?
So at a polling location, there's 2 to 3 election judges. One of them has supremacy for that shift.
Got it.
Shift. And that's determined, unfortunately, in a partisan fashion.
Right.
So, for instance, if the governor won that precinct and the governor happens to be Democrat, then it will be a Democrat presiding judge.
And that judge can preside over how many locations?
Just their location.
Okay.
And so every location has that same setup.
So just so you're clear, we have an agreement among scholars and novices that there should be a framework standard in place.
Absolutely.
But implementation of said standard is going to inevitably be influenced, maybe not by choice, but if it's partisan on who is in charge, there has to be some disagreement, we might think, on even the framework profile that we choose or the details that we choose or the resource allocation.
Sure.
That's
and I mean, and it doesn't even have to be a partisan issue. Say it's
Could be a
somebody
resource issue.
who took the training 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I've been working this polling location for 30 years.
Doesn't
and
want to
then,
change.
then there's a new person who comes in. It's like, I just took the training, and they're like, I'm the presiding judge. I overruled.
Yeah, I mean, look, politics, I don't think are a bad thing, right? Politics are, I think, what makes this country really have a healthy democracy. That's a separate conversation.
Sure.
I think that politics being played right now by critical infrastructure owners are, you have CFOs, CDOs that are pushing digitization efforts.
Sure.
And they want all dollars to go into a really streamlined way that they're using applications, automations, digitization.
Sure.
And then you have kind of the old school. And old school folks are like, hey, just give me my budget. Let me secure this. I don't really care about that digitization effort because my job is to secure this.
Sure.
But globally, prices are down on a lot of things, despite what I think the news says. And so critical infrastructure is having to do a lot more with less. It's the same problem that we have. You have a lot of politics with technical speak, non-technical speak. You got board of directors involved now inside a cyber decision. Yeah. Well, as we round third base on closing out the conversation, two things come to mind for me. Number one, I think three things. First off, I think this NIST 8310 does a really good job of helping you illuminate what are the core things you need to do for the mission objectives. I think the mission objectives are good. The second thing that I've learned today even more, I mean, I came in with this belief system, but now it's really hardened, and that is elections are true blue critical infrastructure, and the complexity of them make it super hard. What I was not aware of, which is a big learning point for me, is how decentralized this process is.
Absolutely. And, a lot of the problems that we hear about, and I think this is where the divisiveness gets built in. Mm-hmm. So when you hear about problems, it's all self-reported.
Okay.
And, then it becomes a narrative base. It becomes a bit of a he said, she said.
Sure.
And there has to be a way to actually detect these problems and report these problems in an unbiased fashion.
I mean, look, in this most simple fashion, we did, I think, 4 or 5 episodes ago, we did a really big piece on the difference between audits and assessments, right? That's pertinent to the conversation now, right? If you assess yourself really effectively, and I say yourself, it could be a group of people, processes, technology, everything that we've talked about today. If you assessed yourself to the 8310 standard, you established that as a known quantity. Hey, we don't have anomaly detection. We don't have some sort of response, but here's some mitigating procedures we put into place, some compensating controls. When there is an issue and you audit that facility, what are you auditing to? Because that's what I think the problem is now. Because there does not exist a framework that has been applied globally or across the county, maybe for partisan politics reasons, the standards exist, right? I think there should be an effort to assess, even in the most rudimentary way possible.
Sure.
What are the top, okay, so we got top 10 mission objectives. What if we did it just to 3? And what if Harris County put together as a kind of a microcosm of a bigger national effort? Maybe there were just 5 cyber controls for this cycle that we're going to implement.
Yeah.
I think the mechanism that folks are using right now is litigation. They're saying, no, we have a problem. We're going to use lawyers to settle it out. And here's the problem. What are they arguing against? What is a standard that was supposed to be met?
What are they arguing against? And it's after the fact.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying something that was more immediate?
So, right. You know this as well as anyone else. Accountability, improvement is all predicated upon transparency.
Sure.
So it's upholding these standards, making them available, widely known, and transmissible to everybody who's involved with this. And, to the regular citizen who just wants to know, well, should I go to this polling location? Is this one of the ones that's approved? Does it adhere to these standards?
Totally.
Yeah.
And on that thread, do different locations, I guess you go to that local judge who owns that location. Would that individual have the authority to conduct an assessment to 8310 in preparation for a seamless?
They don't care. They don't currently, but they could.
Just so we're clear, you have 800 plus polling locations.
Yeah.
Does that mean there are 800 judges?
Yes. Plus.
It's 1-to-1?
Yes.
And that judge is who?
It's somebody who is put up by the party.
Got it.
So and each party can have a judge at each location.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then there's regular poll workers. It's just, hey, I need some seasonal work for $15 an hour. Okay, you're going to come here and do this.
We would have a better chance at getting everybody to agree on a favorite basketball team. I mean, well, politics will be politics.
Yeah.
You know, this isn't for that. It's been a joy talking to you. Elections are a very important component of this country, of any country. I feel that where we're at as a country right now, a lot of people, maybe they do or they don't want to talk about this. I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Absolutely.
For those of you joining us, this is the Business of Cyber series. Really excited to have you join us every single week, either on Tuesdays or Thursdays, where we're connecting cyber business outcomes, business outcomes to cybersecurity investments. And what that means is your people, your process, your technology, your goal set for the next phase of your budget cycle is going to have some downward pressure from non-technical players. We're here to bring to light those conversations to make the security and risk management leaders' jobs better, more efficient, and create a safer critical infrastructure. Thanks for joining us. Join us next week, next Thursday. One of the core authors of ISA 62443-3-2 is going to join us. I'm going to be interviewing him on the core facets of what it takes to really implement that standard. Mr. Colescott, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you.